Dozens of suspected migrants were found dead in a tractor trailer in Texas. I'm sorry.
In Texas, a city worker hearing a call for help found a tractor trailer with at least 46
back
people
to the real
dead
world for a little bit,
inside
and then we'll get back to the fun stuff, okay?
I believe they were migrants seeking a better life here in the U.S. Another 16 people were taken to hospitals, including 4 children, all with heat-related injuries. Authorities describe some as hot to the touch. It happened in San Antonio, Texas, which is no stranger to tragedies like this one, and it's where we find our Omar Villafranca. Omar, good morning. 3 people in custody this morning. We know that. What else do we know at this hour?
52 dead now.
Well, good morning. We don't know the names or the ages of those who are dead, but we do know that of the 16 people taken to the hospital, 12 adults, 4 children. San Antonio is not new to these mass migrant deaths, but the sheer number here has officials stunned.
Tonight we are dealing with a horrific human tragedy.
San Antonio Mayor Ron Nirenberg urged compassion and prayers as local officials described the grisly scene that awaited first responders yesterday evening. The first 911 calls came in just before 6 in the afternoon local time after a city worker in the area heard a cry for help coming from a nearby tractor trailer. That witness then found the doors partially open with a number of deceased individuals inside. When officials arrived on the scene, the enormity of the tragedy became clear.
We're not supposed to open up a truck and see stacks of bodies in there.
Temperatures in the area yesterday ranged from the high 90s to the low 100s.
No.
You're saying fuck the coyotes and like fuck them for being inhumane and pieces of shit. But also, you have to understand that this only happens as a consequence of America's 2-tier immigration system. That's it. That's the only reason why this happens. No one is going to fucking, no one, and I mean no one, is going to slam themselves into the back of a fucking tractor trailer like this, okay, or an 18-wheeler like this, unless they are desperate, okay, unless they're desperate to come into the United States of America. That's how it works. Now, if you don't like the fucking coyotes, which obviously I don't, right? You have to destroy their business. And the only way to destroy their business is by having a non-cruel, non-white nativist, normal immigration process for economic migrants and people who are seeking asylum. So when Greg Abbott says, you know, fuck Joe Brandon for this, he says at least 42 people found dead inside of a truck carrying migrants in Texas. These deaths are on Biden. He's not wrong. These deaths are on Biden. But he's wrong on this account when he says they're a result of his deadly open border policies. That's fucking bullshit. They show the deadly consequences of his refusal to enforce the law. That shit is fucking disgusting. Why is that disgusting? Because Joe Biden and his administration has been utilizing the same exact tactics, including Title 42, to deny asylum seekers safe harbor and their legal right to be able to seek asylum in the United States of America. Okay? The same exact provision that was utilized, called Title 42 under the fucking Trump administration, is being used in this circumstance as well. So yes, these deaths are on Biden, but this fucking disgusting piece of shit who unfortunately survived an attack from an oak tree, okay? And if there was truly karmic justice, he would not have, will use this opportunity to fucking mention something like this, his deadly open border policies. And it's like, how do you say that? If it was a fucking open border, these people would not be crammed in there like fucking sardines, dude. Some people I know line their asylum paperwork and are accepted just because they have dollars. They aren't even in danger. They just have the dollars to move to the U.S. Those in danger, since they can't afford, can't leave the legal way. Yeah. And yes, the U.S. judge blocked Biden's plan to end Title 42 border expulsions, and the federal judge's ruling will extend indefinite suffering of asylum seekers at the U.S.-Mexico border, rights groups say. This happened earlier this year. I just don't understand, like, how you can be a fucking... I don't understand how you can be a Republican and behave like this. It has me... I mean, this is all kinds of fucked up. You just have to straight up be a demon and find absolutely the worst fucking position you can in order to look at this horrifying tragedy of 42 people that were found dead, and the number has now risen to 52, as a matter of fact, and immediately say, wow, this is fucking open border policies.
Signs of water in the vehicle. It was a refrigerated tractor trailer.
Yes, my name's...
But there was no visible working AC unit on that rig.
This is not the first migrant-related tragedy to strike San Antonio in recent years. Back in 2017, 10 migrants died after they were found in a sweltering semi-trailer near a local Walmart. But the sheer number of dead in this latest incident is once again shedding light on a migrant crisis along the southern border and the human smugglers who get them there and beyond. Already this fiscal year, U.S. Customs and Border Protection has recorded more than 1.5 million encounters in the Southwest, nearly the same amount as all of 2021.
We don't know where that trailer was headed, but we're just a few hundred yards from I-35, interstate highway, which starts at the Texas-Mexico border and goes all the way up to Minnesota. It is a known smuggler's route. Investigators with Department of Homeland Security are here on the scene, and they are now leading this investigation. Nate?
Republicans hate immigration. Democrats take advantage of immigrants. No, that's not fucking true at all. That's literally not true. Taking advantage of immigration and immigrants in general for labor is a bipartisan project. If you think that the Democrats and Republicans are somehow different on this matter, you're out of your fucking mind. There's a reason why. There is a reason why corporations don't get punished severely enough for hiring undocumented workers. They can quite literally use the small slap on the wrist that they get from the federal government and budget that in when they are calling ICE on their own workers. This country would not run. Our agricultural production would not happen. Our poultry production would not happen without undocumented migrants being abused inside of factories and in the fucking fields. And what happens is even worse than what you probably know about. They will sometimes endure treacherous conditions. They will have their wages stolen from them. They will have to endure sexual assault at the factory line. And when they try to speak out against such matters, they get ICE called on them. And if you truly wanted to end undocumented immigration, you wouldn't try to desperately enforce, a more draconian border control measure, because you're never going to stop people from trying to come in. They can go under the border. They'll go over the border. The majority of people that actually come into the United States are actually coming by plane and overstaying their visas. The majority of undocumented immigrants in this country are now, and have been for the past decade, coming in legally and overstaying their visas. The main reason, the main way to stop this, if you truly wanted to, is by punishing businesses severely. Punishing businesses severely for hiring undocumented immigrants. Now, you want to know why they don't do that? Because this economy would not run. especially at a time of inflation, you really think that like undocumented migrants would be completely fucking pushed aside? Another thing they won't do, which is what they should do, which is the humane thing to do, is legalizing all of these undocumented immigrants that have been living here. More than 11 million undocumented migrants currently live on U.S. soil. Amnesty for all of them is actually quite a popular idea. The way to legitimately make this situation right is by documenting all of the undocumented workers that live in this country, that have been living in these borders, that have been fundamental in the American economy running, and allow them to unionize alongside the rest of the documented labor force so they can get a bigger percentage of the profits that they generate. But we don't do that. And the reality is that those undocumented migrants, that pool of ever-growing and sometimes shrinking, but usually growing pool that cycles in and out of the border by way of our white supremacist Customs and Border Patrol and our immigrations authorities, are also used as a cudgel against the documented labor force. All of these pieces of shit that claim to care, that claim to care about the border, that claim to care about like undocumented immigrants taking our jobs, they don't actually give a fuck. They are the ones, you are being duped into believing that they are at fault by rich business owners personally take advantage of the two-tier immigration system in this country that has created a two-tier working labor force in this country. Undocumented immigrants are easy to manipulate. They are easy to abuse and exploit. And because at the first sign of pushback, you can always call ICE on them. And corporations often do. If you don't believe me, look no further than Purdue. Not the pharmaceutical manufacturer Purdue for the opiate crisis, but Purdue chicken factories. This happened under the Trump administration, where the Koch Foods chicken processing plant in Morton, Mississippi was targeted by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Some Hispanic employees who were rounded up, a colleague said, wanted to work so badly that they tried to return the next day. Juan Grant strode into the Koch Foods chicken processing plant for his new job on a Wednesday morning, joining many other African Americans in the procession of rubber boots, hairnets, and last cigarettes before the grind. At 20, Mr. Grant was too young to remember the days of nearly all white workforce in Mississippi's poultry industry or the civil rights boycotts and the protests that followed. He did not know the time before Hispanic workers began arriving in the heart of the chicken country by the thousands, recruited by plant managers looking to fill low-paying jobs in an expanding industry. Mr. Grant clearly remembered August 7th, the day the Trump administration performed sweeping immigration raids on 7 chicken plants in central Mississippi. He remembered the news flashing on his phone. 680 Hispanic workers arrested. The raids were believed to be the largest statewide immigration crackdown in recent history and a partial fulfillment of President Trump's vow to remove millions of undocumented workers from the country. The impact of Mississippi's immigrant community has been devastating. For non-immigrant workers, the aftermath has forced them into personal reckoning with questions of morality and economic self-interest. The raids brought suffering, but they also created job openings. Now, the New York Times is very much a foundational part of running and normalizing this kind of brutality, which is why they're pinning black low-wage workers against the even lower wage, even further exploited undocumented immigrant workers. Notice how the framing of this argument is not about the inhumanity of Purdue and of the Mississippi poultry industry, but rather an opportunity and a sense of conflict, a moral conflict internally amongst the black working class in Mississippi that now finally have an opportunity to get a job. This is the liberal, civil, polite way of saying they took our fucking jobs. Okay? Liberals do this exact same shit that the Republicans do as well. Because like I already said, both parties and people from both ideological backgrounds benefit from the severe exploitation of undocumented migrant workers. Okay? The poultry industry recruited them, and now ICE raids are devastating their communities. Take a look at this one, which is a much better perspective on this matter. Now, this ICE raid suspiciously came at a time when the Latinos in the communities, in the factories, were actually complaining about back pay. Were actually complaining about the sexual assaults that were happening inside of the factories. So remember that. It was calculated, strategic, and immediately related to the deeply rooted structures of labor exploitation in the region. Latin American immigrants all the way back in the 90s were recruited to the state by the poultry industry, where they arrived to work in some of the lowest paid and most dangerous jobs in the country. This week's raids target deeply rooted workers and families and leave behind a devastated community while also terrorizing many others in the country. As poultry production expanded, workers' pay and opportunities remained stagnant, and as a result, labor organizing among the plant's predominantly black workforce began to gain traction. Facing the prospect of its first union contract negotiations and in search of a more flexible, exploitatable, and expendable workers in 1994, chicken plant in Morton, Mississippi headed to Miami in search of immigrant labor. There you go. Advertising in Cuban stores and local papers, it took the poultry processor just 1 week to fill a Greyhound bus of immigrants eager for work. The experiment marked the beginning of the plant's formal Hispanic project, which included not just recruitment and transportation from Florida, but also the provision of housing, mostly in dilapidated and overcrowded trailers, as well as a local transportation and leisure activities, all for fees deducted from workers' paychecks that often reduced their meager earnings to below minimum wage. This, my friends, is feudalism. This is a company town. This should have been outlawed, and it was outlawed, except for people who have no right to restitution, for people who have no rights whatsoever, the undocumented labor force. Okay? This is just modern day slavery, but you're offering pennies on the dollar. In its roughly 4 years of operation, the Hispanic Project recruited nearly 5,000 workers to 2 Mississippi towns with a combined population of less than 10,000. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with our disgusting, gross history, okay, I urge you to read the writings of Aviva Chomsky, Noam Chomsky's daughter, who very clearly explains that America's immigration policy has always been tied to capitalism, just like anything else, of course. Going all the way back to the Bracero program, where during World War I and World War II, we took Hispanic migrant workers to make up for the productive capabilities that we're losing in the fucking wars, okay, and boost American corporate profits, only to offer them gas baths and kick them out of the country once we were done, using these Hispanic workers. My grandfather was a bracero. Yeah. The bracero program was so gross and so dehumanizing. They would shave the heads of all the Mexican, Hispanic, Latino migrant workers. They would also give them gas baths. They would use chemical baths to clean them up. My great-grandparents had to get deloused every time they crossed over to work. Yes. Famously, once, because they were seen as expendable, once their use was done for our capital owners, you had basically the same exact fucking ICE-style slave patrols roaming the lands, looking for them in a similar capacity to deport them. This was called, and I'm going to use a term here that you probably are familiar with, Operation Wetback. That was the term that they posted in the front page of the New York Times. So when I tell you this country and its history is founded on white supremacist exploitation of black and brown bodies, of Asian workers as well, this is what I'm talking about. And a lot of those Bracers were people who lived in Texas and were deported. Also, the Bracero program was founded by the guy who made the NRA into what it is today. The delousing process regularly involved literally gassing people with Zyklon B. Now, things have not changed since then. Obviously, this is still something that we are doing. Here is the perfect example of this. The Hispanic Project is a great example of this. Not everyone stayed, but this scheme caught on in the towns where 2 towns in Mississippi brought it with a combined population of less than 10,000, recruited nearly 5,000 workers into those 2 towns. And other plants began recruiting Latino immigrant workers from Florida, Texas, and even farther afield. Getting creative, one poultry processor offered its workers $600 for each new employee they recruited who stayed at least 3 months. Entrepreneurial individuals took full advantage of this incentive to recruit family, friends, and others in their social networks in the United States and their home countries. Yes, Zyklon B is the gas that Nazis used in their camps. Kill Jews and other people. Once these connections were made, the plants no longer had to leave the state to recruit foreign workers. In the words of the architect of the Hispanic Project, they were right here. By the time I arrived to work in Mississippi's poultry communities alongside the Mississippi Poultry Workers Center in 2002, over half of the country's 250,000 poultry workers were immigrants, most of them in the South. A mapping of poultry production and Latino population growth shows that the poultry has been a major driving force of a demographic transformation in the region. In Mississippi, bro, Cesar Chavez hated the immigrants, not just white people. Dog, I know. I will talk about that as well, which is why I always include what I just said. Undocumented migrants have always been used as a cudgel, as a never-ending, fresh pool of labor against the documented working class anytime they have tried to unionize. But the fucking solution is not to beat the shit out of the undocumented laborers and kick them out of the country, but is instead to unite in solidarity, considering that they are simply just the same as Cesar Chavez and others recognizing that the plight is always the same, regardless of what the fucking border dictates. Doesn't matter. If you're working class, if you're a worker, if you are a member of the proletariat, you are exploited by capital owners, regardless of your background, color, creed. The divide between the white working class and black working class is very effective. Just like the divide between the undocumented working class and the documented working class is. Very effective means of destabilizing the population and destroying any semblance of class solidarity, because if class solidarity exists, organizing can happen. And when organizing happens, profit margins will decrease for shareholders, while the actual conditions for the working class will increase and become better. That's how this works. So I don't give a fuck about Chavez, or I don't give a fuck about the unionization efforts in the black community that were working at these poultry factories that ended up being used against the undocumented laborers in this circumstance. I know that, I recognize that, and that's precisely why I mention this every fucking time. Thank you, It's Krang, for the 5 gifted subs, and thank you, J-Dubs Howling, for the 5 gifted subs, allowing 10 people to no longer see the top of the hour ad break. which is coming right now. I'm going to continue with the story right now in a second. Thank you, J-Dubs Howlin'. Okay? Here, you can unite against the top of the hour ad break. Here's the 1 minute ad break now. Anyway. By the time I arrived at work in Mississippi, and this transformation of the poultry workforce has only continued over time, today's Mississippi poultry workers are from nearly every part of the continent, hailing from Argentina, Peru, Guatemala, Mexico, Uruguay, Nicaragua, Cuba, Honduras, Venezuela, and other Latin American and Caribbean countries. They are doing work that is hazardous, painful, and often degrading. They work long hours for low pay, scratching out a living so that the rest of us can buy cheap chicken. And they do so because they were literally invited, recruited, and incentivized to come. For ICE to be conducting raids in Mississippi ignores this history and ignores that the poultry workers were recruited to these towns a quarter of a century ago, have laid down roots. They have made Mississippi home. They've raised families. To understand the inhumanity of white nativist immigration policy this is a fundamental part of understanding how fucking horrifying our immigration policy is. These people were invited to be exploited. They said, sure, the circumstances are dire outside of working at this poultry factory, so I will degrade myself to work in these conditions because that's how desperate I am. But I'll make a living and I will have a family here, only to be stripped away from everything you know and your family, to be kicked, cast aside, and purged out of the country with no due fucking process. Though industry leaders didn't predict it at the time, the Hispanic Project changed the landscape of Mississippi and the rural South. In poultry towns across the region, you can find authentic Mexican food, pick up soccer games, and an abundance of Spanish-language churches and schools brimming with bright and eager young Latino Americans, U.S. citizens who are growing up as Southern as their peers. Another great example of this happened in Hazletown in Pennsylvania, a town that was slated for complete decommission. Okay? A town that was at the precipice of complete fucking bankruptcy. A town that industry had cast aside. Then the Latino population came in. Tucker Carlson loves using the white people that remained in the town and their anger towards the incoming Hispanic population as an example. Except the real example of Hazletown is the Latino immigration population completely turning it around and breathing life back into the town with industry. Hazleton is a great example of immigration creating a robust infrastructure and creating job opportunities for everyone. But if you're a white supremacist piece of shit, you would rather die and starve on your own as your white masters decided to cast you aside for profit-seeking behavior as they move manufacturing overseas. You would rather spit on the hand that feeds you. That's how fucking damaging white supremacy is. And that's often how white supremacy hurts white people too. So if today, when you hear a story like this with 52 now, dead children and adults trapped inside of a fucking incredibly hot trailer behind an 18-wheeler, if you understand, or if you want to understand why they're in that predicament, recognize that they had to literally sell everything they had. Some fucking coyotes whose entire business is funded by our lack of sane drug laws, by the way, outside of the ridiculous border policies that we have, who decide, you know what, I would rather go with these gangsters. I would rather take a shot with these gangsters in the hopes that I can survive and make a living in the United States of America, a country that is just outright hostile towards me. That's how desperate these people are. And the only thing they're guilty of is trying to have a peaceful and better future for themselves and their children. It's completely unjustifiable. It is so inhumane. It is so evil. Fuck. Rooted members of the community, regardless of immigration status, deserve better than be ripped away from their jobs and loved ones. Although neighbors and community organizations like Mississippi Immigrants' Rights Alliance are working to support affected children and their families, these raids ripple through communities, devastating individuals and families, and the most vulnerable people pay the highest price. As the alt-right celebrates this wreckage as another win for white nationalists, let us keep in view that these immigrants are here because 25 years ago, one Mississippi poultry executive conceived an inventive idea to flood the processing lines with eager and compliant immigrant workers. And while they come at an enormous cost to thriving, vibrant communities, these raids do little to affect the immigration trends. People continue to migrate to the United States to survive. Worse than murder, Mexican farmers feed you. You kill them with your voting. This is worse than murder. Yeah. What they do affect is the working conditions for what they do affects is the working condition of everyone. With the threat of family separation, detention, and deportation hanging over people's heads, immigrant workers are less likely to organize and less likely to speak out against poor conditions. That is by design. This is American industry utilizing the American federal government and our horrifying immigration policies to keep the immigrant working class subjugated. The threat of systemic violence is how they keep these individuals complacent with the structural violence of poverty that they are subjected to. And employers are more likely to take advantage of them. This ripples through the economy, depressing wages for U.S.-born workers as well. Exactly. If unions have a likelihood of increasing your wages, even if you are not a part of a union, this does have a way of depressing wages for the rest of the U.S. working class. So when Republicans say that, there is some truth to that. But the solution is not to purge these Latino workers. The solution is to legalize them. The solution is to allow them the proper paperwork and documentation. The solution is to give them amnesty. The solution is to then allow them to unionize alongside the rest of the documented working class. But in this country, we don't want the documented working class of laborers to unionize either. It is no accident that only 10% of our labor force is unionized, and that number is shrinking. The mounting threat of deportation and rising xenophobia helps keep workers compliant, serving owners' interests and consumers' pocketbooks, but harming the people who prepare our food. Yep. This is how it works. Did we talk about the Bracero program that they covered?
What came first, illegal immigration or the wall? The U.S.-Mexico border is the most militarized border in the world, with the exception of the Korean DMZ. There are over 700 miles of fencing, patrolled by 20,000 Border Patrol agents. Each year, American taxpayers spend over $4.8 billion on Border Patrol and another $8.4 billion on immigrations and custom enforcement. Is our southern border really worth all the money and taxes we're pouring into it? Hello, I'm Dr. Douglas Massey. I'm a professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton University. I've been the director of the Mexican Migration Project since 1982. I've been collecting real-time data on what's going on at the border, and none of the conclusions I've reached, to my knowledge, have ever been challenged by anyone. What many Americans might not realize is just how new all of this border security is. In the early years of our republic, there was no firm border line, only a fuzzy western frontier. As the frontier pushed westward, the border between America and its neighbors continued to be blurred. When the southern border was finalized in the mid-1800s, it was still soft and porous, an invisible line on a map that ran through the middle of towns and even houses. In the early 1900s, labor shortages led many American farmers to begin recruiting field workers from Mexico. The work was seasonal, though, with workers coming from Mexico for the planting and harvest, and then returning to Mexico for the off-seasons. Because they only stayed for the harvest, Mexican workers were not considered immigrants and weren't included in early immigration laws that put quotas on other nations. The U.S. Border Patrol was established in 1924 not to prevent the entry of Mexicans, but to catch Europeans who were trying to get around the quotas at Ellis Island. During the Second World War, the U.S. government actually encouraged migration through a temporary worker program. The Bracero program was created in 1942 and steadily expanded after the war ended. By the late 1950s, it was recruiting around 450,000 Mexicans per year for temporary labor in the United States. Everything changed in 1965 when the Bracero program was ended and numerical limits were put on Mexican immigration for the first time. Almost overnight, Mexico went from having access to around 500,000 legal visas to less than 20,000 permanent resident visas and no work visas. But the demand for agricultural labor didn't go away, and what was now unauthorized or illegal migration rose to fill the gap left by the end of the Bracero program. Border apprehensions went from 40,000 a year in 1965 to over 1.6 million in 1986.
Originally, the main people that were against the Bracero program, by the way, or rather the border apprehension, was ironically the fucking Yee Texas boys, who would literally fucking make it as difficult as possible for cops and the Border Patrol to find Mexican people and arrest them. Part of the reason for why they were actually anti-Border Patrol was because they recognized that these were people that were working in the fucking farms. They would literally kill cops. There was a time and place when Texan motherfuckers would literally kill cops. Straight up.
However, these were still seasonal workers, and the flow was still circular, with 86% of undocumented workers returning home at the end of the season. In practical terms, little had changed in the Mexican-American migration system, but in symbolic terms, much had changed. For now, the majority of migrants were illegal, and thus, by definition, considered to be criminals and lawbreakers, while the demand for seasonal agricultural work stayed the same.
By the way, anyone who tells you that this has nothing to do with the tendency of profit rate to fall is completely a fucking liar. The reason why these migrant workers that were the fucking backbone of American agriculture all of a sudden found themselves illegal and no longer seen as like seasonal workers that could come and go as they please was because we recognize that you could squeeze out more profits and depress their wages further by using white supremacy as a justification for their additional subjugation. When you are a migrant worker, you can actually advocate for your rights a little bit better than a undocumented worker, which now has no legal restitution.
What the government did was criminalize its workers. Reacting to this perceived change, the U.S. government began pouring more and more resources into the Border Patrol. From 1986 to 2010, the number of uniformed Border Patrol officers increased 5.6 times. The agency's budget grew by a factor of 17, and hundreds of miles of walls and fencing were constructed around ports of entry. None of the extra border security did anything to stop border crossings. During the 1970s and 80s, the odds of a migrant being apprehended while crossing the
How do we know how much of that was grassroots white hate and how much was that top-down channeling of that hate? Man, people don't learn people aren't born with white supremacist bones, dude. It's all learned behavior. Of course it was fucking top down. You think these dumbasses do you think these dumbasses are just born racist? No, they learn it from their fucking dumbass parents, who learn it from their dumbass parents, who also at a certain point learned it from whatever the fucking newspapers were saying, whatever the radio was telling them, whatever the fucking government was designing as an immigration policy and justifying. I hate people that say tribalism is a thing, though. It doesn't matter. There is no naturalistic phenomena, okay? If you're a human being and not a fucking animal, which I think most of you are, I hope, you recognize that there's a reason why it's called a fallacy. Because the entire project of humanity is designed around overcoming natural phenomena. Do you live inside of a house? Do you think that that is natural? This notion that tribalism is a natural thing. It's like, you're such a fucking idiot, dude. The entire point of being a human being is overcoming things that you see in nature, things that you experience in fucking nature. I cannot believe that someone literally fucking typing out on twitch.tv would have such a pathetic, idiotic, Luddite attitude on a perhaps the weakest justification for racism. You're on Twitch. The fuck do you mean? Oh, it's natural tribalism. You're on Twitch. I wasn't talking about you, duburbs. There's someone else said it was a natural thing. Tribalism is natural. I feel bad using Luddite as a pejorative, considering how much more they have actually fought alongside, unions and oftentimes are on the right side of history when it comes down to, being pro-social justice.
The border was about 1 in 3. As more resources were poured into the Border Patrol, migrants began crossing in more and more remote parts of the border, and the odds of a migrant being apprehended actually went down for a while. The diversion of border crossings into remote areas lowered the odds of apprehension, but it also increased the risk of injury and even death. For in addition to being less populated and less patrolled, these desolate areas were also more dangerous. Between 1993 and 2010, the number of deaths along the border skyrocketed. Coyotes and other smugglers moved in to capitalize on the new black market. And border crossing became much more expensive. In the 2 decades after 1993, the cost of hiring a coyote to cross the border increased by a factor of 4.6 in real terms. But the biggest impact of increased border security was that for the first time in the history of Mexican-American migration, the movement of migrants stopped being circular, finding it increasingly difficult and dangerous and expensive to move back and forth across the border for seasonal work. Migrants began staying in America during the off-seasons. As men stayed longer north of the border, they were increasingly joined by wives and children, transitioning from a seasonal migrant flow to a permanently settled population. In other words, the effect of restrictive immigration and border policies was the creation of an undocumented population. Removing the Bracero program made a traditional migratory system illegal. Building walls on the southern border didn't keep people out, but rather trapped them in. Since 2007, the number of undocumented migrants in the United States has actually declined, not because of the efforts of Border Patrol, but rather because of an unrelated shift in Mexican migration patterns. In the last 15 years, more people have moved from the U.S. to Mexico than from Mexico to the United States. This shift was started by the 2008 recession, but has been continued by a change in Mexico's age demographics. People tend to migrate when they're younger. If they do not move before the age of 30, they're very unlikely to move at all. In the last 50 years, Mexico's fertility rate has dropped from 7.2 children per woman to 2.1 children per woman, and the median age of the Mexican population has gone from 16.7 to 29.3, turning Mexico into an aging country. New undocumented immigrants in recent years have come not from Mexico, but from other countries. Today, most undocumented immigrants enter the United States legally. They enter as tourists and overstay their visas. Border security doesn't affect them. And yet still, to this day, there are calls to increase Border Patrol staffing and to build more barriers and to strengthen our borders. Why? No matter which way you stand on the issue, there are better ways to address undocumented migration than a largely symbolic, totally ineffective, and extremely expensive border wall.